With affordability continuing to be the buzzword for New York policymakers as they work on a state budget, we wanted to explore the cost of food and specifically what can be done to help low-income New Yorkers avoid hunger. For more on that issue, we're joined in the Capitol Press Room studio by Krista Hesdorfer, Director of Public Affairs for Hunger Solutions New York. Thanks for visiting us in the studio, Krista.
Thanks so much for having me.
So late last month, before the budget was actually due, your group was part of a coalition that flagged a couple of budgetary items to support food security programs. And I wanted to start with the support for what's known as WIC, which supports pregnant women and their babies through the first few years of life. Before we get into the ask, can you help listeners understand why you think this is a good investment?
So WIC is a federally funded nutrition program, which means it's one of the most cost-effective investments the state can make. With just a small amount of state money invested in improving access to programs like WIC and SNAP, we can draw down millions, actually billions for SNAP in federally funded food benefits that people spend at local grocery stores, bodegas, farmers markets. So it's a way of reducing food insecurity, improving affordability, and supporting economic growth all at the same time with these really modest and targeted state investments.
And if we just maintain the status quo, what does that mean for this population?
So what we're seeing is that budget shortfalls for WIC agencies are jeopardizing access to the program.
Mm-hmm.
So WIC participation has increased by about 28% over the last 5 years, and that's a huge public health victory. It means that more moms and moms-to-be and young children are getting access to the food that they need. But at the same time as we've seen that dramatic participation growth, the funding for WIC agencies that operate in local communities and run this program has remained about flat over that same 5-year period. We're seeing budget shortfalls that are leading to staff reductions, reduced access to services, and really long wait times for appointments in some cases when we're trying to reach kids at time-sensitive periods of development. So maintaining the status quo is not an option. We need to invest in the infrastructure of this program and make sure that New Yorkers can access it.
And I mean, to be specific, the letter that was sent to the legislative leaders and governor says that an estimated 200,000 New Yorkers are eligible for WIC but not enrolled. So is that just a lack of support for those local or state agencies who would be enrolling people? Is this about just running out of dollars for the program? What is the problem there?
So New York was actually operating an extremely successful outreach project to reach more of those New Yorkers who are eligible for WIC but not yet participating.
Mm-hmm.
But because of these budget shortfalls at WIC agencies and these capacity concerns, that project was terminated. So part of the $30 million ask that we're elevating for the state budget is to reinstate outreach to make sure that we're capturing those 200,000 New Yorkers who could and should be benefiting from a federally funded program.
And $30 million compared to what?
Compared to previous investments.
Sure.
So there's a long-standing investment in WIC agency infrastructure that's about $9 million, and we're looking to bump that up to the $30 million.
And would that then be a continuous number that you would look to see funded in state budgets in order to ensure there isn't drop-off, or would this potentially be more of a one-time investment?
So ultimately, this is, like many other things, an issue that should be resolved at the federal level. In an ideal federal environment, we would see an improvement in the way that local WIC agencies are funded so that their funding from the federal government actually aligns with the costs of operating the program in a state like New York. But until then, and we'll keep advocating for that, we need New York State to step up and fill that gap and make sure that our state is maximizing those federal dollars.
Outside of money for the WIC program, is there anything else that the state could do to ensure a better administration of this program, whether it has to do with eligibility requirements or how people access the money? Is there anything else that could be done to see better outcomes that might not cost money but would require some sort of rule or regulation changes?
New York is actually doing a great job administering WIC. I have to give credit where it's due. New York has implemented every available flexibility and waiver at the federal level. We're allowing remote services, so folks have the option of accessing WIC without physically traveling to a WIC clinic. We have EBT cards that have made WIC much easier to use and less stigmatizing. There's an app that makes it easier to shop with WIC benefits. So they're really maximizing the program on the administrative side, and we really just need the funding to maintain those modernizations and bolster the infrastructure of the local WIC agencies.
Well, shout out to my Aunt Robin, who used to work on the WIC program for the state.
Shout out to your Aunt Robin.
Yeah, apparently they did a good job. I want to pivot to another federal program administered by the state, and that's the SNAP benefit that I think a lot of people know as a key resource for helping low-income New Yorkers access food. Your letter highlights this idea of maximizing SNAP dollars, and this has to do with so-called SNAP navigators. Who are they, or what are they, and how are they integral to ensuring that we are getting our bang for our buck when it comes to accessing SNAP dollars?
So New York has a network of SNAP navigators. It's called the Nutrition Outreach and Education Program, or NOEP. There are 86 navigators operating in local, trusted community organizations across the state. And they help families through every step of the process, from figuring out if they may be eligible for SNAP to completing an application and gathering and submitting documentation. If there are barriers to access, if something happens in the application process and they're wrongfully denied, the SNAP navigators can help advocate for folks. So really from start to finish, helping people connect with this federally funded program. And because the SNAP Navigator program is drawing down so much in federal benefits, it's estimated to have more than a 25-to-1 return on investment to the state.
So what sort of investment are you looking for from the state policymakers in the budget?
We're asking for $8.5 million for the SNAP Navigator program. That's an increase from last year when we received about $5.6 million. And that increase is just to sustain the access to SNAP Navigators in light of federal cuts that are starting in October. So it's really just to bring the funding up to make up for that federal cut and ensure that folks across the state have continued access to this service, especially as new rules are coming down from the federal government that make SNAP harder to access.
And just to be clear then about the return on investment here, you're talking about a $3 million investment in a program where for every dollar you spend, you're generating a $25 return to the state. So essentially by not doing this, the state would be forfeiting a $75 million return on investment.
Yep, you heard it here, folks. It's a really cost-effective way to leverage our state budget and draw down federal dollars.
And what about the SNAP benefits themselves? Is there anything that you think the state should be doing to augment what people can get? Because one of the recurring issues that we hear about is this idea that at the low end, at the very basic benefit that someone might be eligible for, depending on their income threshold, it's not going to make ends meet if this is what you're going to be relying on to feed yourself.
Right. So the average SNAP benefit covers less than 2 meals a day in New York State. So certainly...
And I eat 3 times a day.
Right. Me too. Me
out.
too. And some folks are receiving as little as $24 a month. That's the federal minimum SNAP benefit. So we are encouraging the state to provide a supplement and bring all New Yorkers up to at least $100 per month. That's certainly not enough to cover a month's worth of groceries, but it'll stretch a lot further than $24.
So this conversation that we're having is not in a vacuum, as we've talked about. These are federal programs, and we're just talking about what the state can do to really maximize that investment. What are you looking for from the federal government to support hungry New Yorkers then?
Well, the issues that we're running into with SNAP right now are a result of H.R. 1, the federal budget bill that was passed last summer. Mm-hmm. That bill included the largest cut to SNAP in American history. It cuts about $186 billion from SNAP over the next 10 years. So ultimately, we're looking for lawmakers to repeal those changes. Right now, we are focused on delaying, at the very least, the cost shifts that were included in that bill that cut federal funding for SNAP administration and for a portion of benefits, and then forces states and county governments to fill that gap. Those cost shifts are going to come into play for New York very soon. The benefit cost shift could require the state budget to cover $1.2 billion annually starting in future years. So we're, of course, deeply concerned about what that means for other state budget investments that help people meet their basic needs. So we are urging our delegation and Congress as a whole to, at the very least, delay those cost shifts, give states a chance to prepare. But ultimately, it's bad policymaking, and all of the SNAP provisions in H.R. 1 should be repealed.
Well, as your budget letter reflects, there is some movement on both of these issues in the so-called one-house budgets from the Senate and Assembly Democrats. What about the governor's initial budget? Does that seem to reflect the challenges that you've just outlined from the federal level, or is it primarily business as usual?
Well, we were really pleased to see funding for EBT chip cards in the governor's budget. That was a major victory on the SNAP side.
Can you walk us through why that's a big deal?
Sure. So New York is actually the hardest hit state in the nation when it comes to benefit theft. SNAP benefits are being skimmed off of folks' EBT cards when they, swipe the card at the grocery store or farmer's market. Criminals will steal those benefits and drain the card so the family has no resources to use to buy groceries. About 165,000 New Yorkers reported benefit theft just in a short period of time when the federal government was collecting that information. It's, tens of millions of dollars of benefits that have been stolen. So what we need is for EBT cards to be just as secure as our credit and debit cards that have chip-enabled tap technology so that the skimming can't happen. You're not swiping the card through the point of sale system. So that requires funding to replace a massive amount of EBT cards with this more secure technology. And that funding was included in the governor's budget, and the Assembly and Senate supported it in their one houses as well.
What's your expectation for the timeline of turning something like that around? Because we've spoken with the commissioner for the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance about this in the past, and she was making the pitch years ago about, hey, please give us some money for this. Now it looks like it's actually going to be there. What are your expectations for how this turnaround might look like in terms of getting people these new cards?
We hope to see new EBT cards in the hands of folks within the next year or so. It is something that takes time to do responsibly. We had some lessons learned from the first states that rolled out EBT chip cards, and in some cases they ran into issues with cards not actually working at the point of sale and needing to fall back to the swipe mechanism, which defeats the purpose. Sure. So I think there's been a lot of learnings, but we need the state to approach this carefully and thoughtfully. And from every conversation I've had with them, that's exactly what they're doing. They're preparing. They're going to move as quickly as they possibly can, but we also want to make sure not to disrupt benefit access throughout the rollout.
Well, finally, if listeners want to do something to help ensure that people aren't going hungry, aside from maybe calling up their local lawmakers or the governor to advocate for what we've talked about, is there anything that you think they can do in their communities that could make a difference? Is there anything you'd recommend they donate to or spend their time supporting?
Well, there's a range of ways to get involved. Certainly, folks can donate to a local food pantry or emergency food provider. If they want to get involved in advocacy, we have actions available at hungersolutionsny.org/take action. And then the other piece I would recommend is, as folks are encountering these new rules for SNAP that are coming down from the federal government, we want to know how it's affecting them, how it's affecting their community, so that we can educate lawmakers and ultimately repeal these harmful changes. So just sharing your story, getting in touch with us or with a local provider, and making your voices heard is really impactful.
Well, we've been speaking with Krista Hesdorfer. She's the Director of Public Affairs for Hunger Solutions New York. Krista, thanks for visiting us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.